Tim, good to have you back on the show.
Good to be back. What's good, Tim?
Well, it's feeling like fall here in Ohio, which I think is the best time of year here in Ohio.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we've had some great weather, and football is right around the corner. I think you're going to be missing it though, right? The home opener. We're going to be on the road when your Eagles open up on Thursday night.
We hang the banner against the Cowboys, but there's college football this weekend. So I'm really excited about that and start getting into like fall beers and pumpkin spice and all that stuff. I love this time of year.
Well, fall beers and you're going to be burning some wood, new patio out back, which is gorgeous. The project you guys did over the summer.
Oh, yeah.
So, man, this is the weather for it.
Yes.
This is the weather for it.
Yeah, I'm stoked.
So today we're going to dive into talking about HSAs, more specifically, common mistakes that we see pharmacists making around HSA accounts. We've covered HSAs in detail before on the show. We've got a podcast episode, The Power of a Health Savings Account. We also have a blog article that talks about how to potentially leverage HSA accounts as a part of your broader financial plan. We'll link to both of those in the show notes. Great background information. But we want to hone more specifically on the mistakes aspects with HSAs because they are great accounts. They can be a great part of the financial plan, but also we want to make sure that we're not misstepping along the way and using them in the best that we can. So, Tim, before we get into those mistakes, I'd love to kick off with more of the foundation. Walk us through the essentials of an HSA, what they are, who can use them, how the contribution limits work, and what makes them really such a compelling vehicle for both current healthcare expenses, but perhaps long-term savings as well.
Yeah, so HSAs are kind of like the new Roth IRA, and they're not new, but they've been around for a while. But I remember like when I was kind of growing up, it's like have a Roth IRA. At least that's what my parents told me. And I feel like HSAs have kind of supplanted I dare say coolness, but like the benefits because of the triple tax benefits. So typically an HSA, Tim, is paired with an HDHP, which is a high deductible health plan. So if, we've talked about this in the past, like if you're typically younger and or healthier, you're not necessarily going to the doctor often, that would be an attractive health plan to enroll in, when you're going through that with your employer. So, and the reason for that, Tim, it really is because, you pay one way or the other. So typically with a high deductible health plan, you pay less in terms of salary deferral to pay for that health plan, but you pay more on the back end. But if you're healthy and you don't necessarily go to the doctor as much, that shouldn't be as much of a problem. Whereas more of a Cadillac plan, you pay more out of the salary deferral, so you pay more up front, but you pay less on the back end. So if that describes you, where you're like, hey, I don't go to the doctor that often, I don't really, we're not going to have a baby or have a major surgery or whatever, then like a high deductible plan is, potentially where you want to be. And what constitutes a high deductible plan is typically where if you're an individual, you have a minimum annual deductible, and these are 2025 numbers of $1,650 and a maximum out-of-pocket limit of $8,300. For a family, so that's, you're covering a spouse and or kids, that minimum annual deductible is $3,300 for the year, and then the maximum out-of-pocket is $16,600. So if your health plan kind of falls into those parameters, then you are in a high deductible health plan and you have the option of funding an HSA. And for an individual, you can fund up to $4,300 per year. For a family, $8,550, and then there's also $1,000 per year catch up once you reach age 55 and or older. So that's kind of the backdrop. And again, what the attractive thing about the HSA is the triple tax benefit. So it goes in pre-tax, it grows tax for deferred, and then it comes out tax-free if it's used for qualified medical expenses. For a lot of people, there's benefit, right? So if you can escape the tax man completely, that's great, but it also opens up a bucket of money that you could potentially use, not necessarily for medical expenses, but for just long-term retirement expenses or things like that. So there's a lot of versatility to it. And that's why people typically like the HSA.
And one of the risks I see here, right? We talk about this a lot when we hone in on one part of the financial plan is people hear that and then they start running off with like, I need an HSA, right? Got to max it out. And I think there's an overarching question of like, do I need an HSA at all, right? Is that the right move? And we want to be careful here about chasing tax benefits if the HSA isn't necessarily the right fit for their financial plan. So talk to us a little bit more about that before we get too far in the weeds.
Yeah, and I've had conversations with prospective clients over this last year where, they're saying like, oh, I'm maxing out the HSA. Like I heard YFP talk about it, or I read it somewhere. And I'm like, great. But then they're also saying like, hey, I have these surgeries, or, maybe they're having a child, so there's hospital bills. And, I kind of question the alignment of, does it actually make sense to have an HSA? Now, some employers, that's all they offer, high deductible health plans, because we know of the, we know YFP and, and for other small businesses know like how expensive health insurance can be.
Yeah.
So that might be the best you got. But if not, I think a more critical look at what health plan should I be enrolled in, and maybe I do pay a little bit more upfront, and I'm locking myself out of the HSA for a year or indefinitely because I have, some, health expenses on the horizon. So I think sometimes we see, the headlines of HSA or Roth or whatever, and it's like, I got to fund these, but you're not necessarily aligning what's going on in your life. And I will say, and this could be a mistake that we don't necessarily talk about, but it's almost like a year-to-year decision. And this is the same thing in, with like Medicare. Like when you get to retirement and you sign up for Medicare, it's not a one and done decision. It's an annual decision that you're making every year, unlike something like Social Security claiming strategy. So the same is true with your health insurance. And obviously we have open enrollment every year to kind of figure this out. But Shay and I, like when we'd have a baby, we were like, all right, well, now it's time for her not to be in a health deductible plan. Let's be in a more of a gold or like a platinum plan. And then, when we were through that, and thankfully, we can't foresee the future, but like, we're healthy and we don't see ourselves going to the doctor a little bit, then we would, go back into an HSA type of health plan. So I think it's not necessarily using those annual planning opportunities to make sure that we're mainly optimized. But yeah, to go back to your point, Tim, like we kind of sometimes do things that aren't necessarily in our best interest to save a couple bucks on taxes. And, that's not necessarily the best thing. So
let's talk too briefly while we're defining the HSA. I think there's still a fair amount of confusion of how is an HSA different from an FSA, right? FSA, flexible savings account. I think a lot of people are familiar with those. HSAs, if someone's been enrolled in a high deductible health plan, as you mentioned, that essentially is the key that unlocks, right, the access to the HSA. But important distinction around the use it or lose it component of an FSA versus an HSA. So just define that briefly so we make sure that we're on the same page terminology wise.
Yeah. So like for an FSA, you kind of are taking a calculated gamble or risk of like how much you should put in this account to cover down on medical expenses. So you're like, all right, last year maybe I spent $3,000 or $6,000. So you're trying to figure out, okay, how much should I put in for this upcoming year where I can get a tax benefit? So it's a little bit of a gamble because if you don't use that, you lose that money, which I kind of just don't like the whole premise of that. Whereas an FSA is really just a pass-through account. It goes in there, you kind of shelter yourself from a little bit of tax, but then you're withdrawing it for, the medical expenses. And sometimes what people do, and a lot of FSAs have a grace period, but like you're out and you're buying like contact solution or things like in bulk, right? Because you're just trying to spend these dollars that you're going to otherwise lose. Not every FSA has a grace period. So like once you hit a date, then you just lose that money. Part of me about that just doesn't love that because again, you're trying to, like if you lose a couple $100, like you didn't get that in from a tax perspective. So I just don't like the design of those plans. The way so if you compare that against an HSA can be a pass-through account where you put money in, you get a triple tax benefit if it does invest and it grows. But you can also be an accumulation account where just like we think of, an IRA or a 401k, you could let that money sit there and grow over a, 10, 20, 30-year period. So the way that I think of these, Tim, is HSA, FSA, starts with F, use it or lose it. So like if you don't use it, it's a F expletive. Like that's the way I think about it in my head. So FSAs are use or lose. Crap, I didn't use it. I lost this money. HSA is more of an accumulation account. So more of the long run. So that I think is the big difference. And I think some people will talk about, and maybe they're just talking about it synonymously, but they'll talk about an HSA as if they have to use it. And I'm like, you don't, you can actually stack years of contributions and that money's not going to leave you.
Good stuff. So let's hit the HSA highlight reel before we go into the common mistakes. So as you mentioned, high deductible health plan, right? That's the piece that unlocks our access to investing in an HSA. So not everyone might even invest in an HSA.
Yeah.
Triple tax benefits, which I don't know if that doesn't get you excited. I don't know what does. And then contribution limits for 2025, these will change yearly.
Yep.
$4,300 for individuals, $8,550 for families. There's a catch-up provision for those 55 and plus. And then pass-through, right? As you mentioned, they can be a pass-through, or it can be an accumulation account where you can roll the funds over year to year. They're individually owned. They can function as a retirement healthcare fund if you so choose. And they can also transition with you. It's a common question I get, like, hey, when I leave my employer, do I no longer have access to an HSA, right? Those funds can go with you. So with that background, let's jump into some common HSA mistakes to avoid. And I think the first one, Tim, which is a nice jump from some of that background information, is not investing those HSA funds or missing out on some of the long-term growth. Now, let's be clear. If you need the funds for healthcare expenses and there's not an ability to cash flow those dollars, like that's what they're there for. And there still is a pass-through tax benefit. But there's an opportunity, or there's a potential, especially if you're able to cash flow some of those expenses as they come up. So let's say we enroll in a high deductible health plan. We didn't think anything significant was going to happen. Like, I'll put myself in the camp for this year. Oh, guess what? All of a sudden you tear your Achilles and you got to have a surgery, right? Didn't plan on that. But if we can cash flow that and let those funds ride and grow, there can be a real value in that. So talk to us more about this first mistake of not investing those HSA funds, missing long-term growth, and maybe just having them sit in cash.
Yeah. So like if you are, again, thinking about this as like, the secondary name for an HSA is a stealth Roth IRA. And oftentimes what happens is that people put money into it, or it gets deferred from a salary, a paycheck, and then it just sits because you have to take action to actually get the dollars from cash into the market. So right. I think first it goes back to like, what's the purpose? And if you're using those dollars, then like we shouldn't be exposing it to risk in the market. It should just be really cash. But if your plan is to use it more as a stealth IRA, then it should be invested, and I think invested fairly aggressively, i.e. equities. And again, there's shades of gray to that, but that's just kind of my view. So a lot of people will put money into it thinking that it's being invested, but you kind of have to set that up, unlike a 401k, often if you put money into that and you don't do anything, they're going to kind of default you to at least a target date fund based on your age and things like that. That's not true for an HSA, where you have to go in there, and sometimes you have to link it to like a different institution and then go in and pick the funds there. And then there's this whole kind of weird process potentially of like moving from cash into investment. So it can be a little bit convoluted. So, and I see this in, straight up investing. Someone will say like, yeah, I opened a brokerage account and I thought I was investing, but it was just sat in cash for a couple of years. So this is that case where you have to kind of do a little bit more legwork to kind of get it from cash into an investment. And I think the difficult thing about this, Tim, too, is like not all HSAs are created equal in terms of your ability to invest. So some allow you to invest the first dollar. Some allow you to invest the first dollar after you have a balance of 1,000 or something like that. So it can be a little bit confusing of like where you're starting and stopping of like, what can I do and what can I do? And it's something like 1/5 of HSA users invest their balances. So most don't, or they're just using them for, a current medical expenses. So it's just understanding and aligning what the purpose of the plan or the account is, and then aligning that to your investment or cash strategy, if that makes sense.
No, that's great stuff. And again, just to reiterate what we said, like if you have a healthcare expense come up and there's not an ability to cash flow that such that the funds in the HSA can continue to grow and do their thing, then like that's what those funds are there for,
Yeah.
right? But if we know that, if we know we're going to use those, to reiterate the point you made earlier, we most likely don't want to be able to put those funds at risk to market volatility, right? What we don't want to happen is you've got $7,000 that you put in an HSA, you know you've got $5,000 or $6,000 of expenses coming up because of a surgery or whatever might be the case. We dump them in the market, we take on a bunch of risk, and all of a sudden the market goes down 20%,
Right.
and then we need to use those funds, right? We're obviously working against ourselves at that point in time. So yeah, I think the data you pointed to, and we'll link to that reference in the show notes from Investment News, is a really interesting one, showing that only about 20% are looking at investing the dollars that are in their HSA accounts. And it's simple time value money, right? If you're in your 40s, mid 40s even, right? Because I think sometimes we talk about these, Tim, like as if, hey, that newer practitioner just starting, if you can max out your HSA account and just let those funds ride and cash flow all your other expenses. And that would be nice because obviously time value money is going to do its things. But so often it's in that same phase of life where we've got student loan debt, we're buying a home, right? We have all these other competing expenses. So it may be more realistic even that it's someone a little bit further along. Hey, I'm in my 40s. I've got a high deductible health plan. I've got good cash reserves. We've made progress in other parts of the plan. And now we can really start to think about leveraging this HSA as a secondary account. And even for 20, 25 years, if those funds can ride, if we look at the maximum contribution limit per year, that's going to be a pretty sizable amount that we know, as we've talked about in this show, healthcare expenses and retirement are a real thing. There will be a time and place to use this.
Yeah, and I think the data shows is that, after like your housing, when you get to kind of they call it like old retirement, that's going to be the lion's share of what your money is spent on. So if you can have that kind of in your back pocket, to be able to access, that's huge. So yeah, and I wonder, like, the 20%, Tim, I wonder of people that invest it, I wonder how much of that is attributed to like an intentional, like, no, we need to use this for today's medical expenses, and how much of that is attributed to like, I thought I was investing or I didn't take that extra step to do so. But the opportunity cost is real, right? Because you're typically, you could be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars that you could potentially amass in, earnings over, decades of time versus not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a real thing to analyze and kind of determine like what's best for you.
The next mistake we want to talk about is not maximizing employer and payroll contributions, potentially exceeding limits as well. So, Tim, what are some thoughts here, mistakes that people might make around contribution limits, especially if I'm thinking about a job change, that could happen as well.
Yeah, and you see this with 401ks, where you work for an employer and you are putting in an amount in the 401k and then the HSA, and then when you go to the new one, like you start over contributing because those two accounts, the old 401k to the new 401k, and then the old HSA and the new HSA aren't speaking, right? So you get to this spot where you're like, oh, I over contributed to these accounts because they're not within the same system. So you typically see that with job change. But the other interesting thing about the HSA compared to like a 401k is that there are like a lot of HSAs that let you straight up like contribute to the HSA that's not a salary deferral. So like the only way to put money into a 401k is really like take it out of your paycheck and that goes in there. I can't write a check to my 401k or, put an ACH into my 401k from my bank account.
Right.
But for an HSA, you can. So it gets convoluted because, and then if you throw in like, and what we do at YFP is that, we provide an employer contribution if you enroll in a high deductible plan and you're in an HSA to incentivize those types of health plans, frankly, because they're cheaper. We incentivize employees by, I think whatever our match is, we match $500, but that amount counts towards your annual contribution limit,
Right.
which is which is different. For like a 401k, you can put up to X amount of dollars, and then that's in addition, right?
Right.
So there are these instances where you can bust through your contribution limits, and then you're paying, I don't know if it's the excise tax on that or penalty is like 6%. That's typically what it is for some of the other. I think it is consistent to that. But then you're getting penalized because you're putting too much money into that. So
Mhm.
that's the big thing. And then I think one, for, clients or prospective clients or, listeners out there that are kind of in the pre-retiree is like, once you enroll in Medicare, you can't
Yep.
contribute to an HSA. So even though there's a 55 and older catch-up limit, when you start the process of enrolling in Medicare, that HSA contribution has to shut off. And that's important to know that a lot of people, might not necessarily think of. So
Mhm.
those would be some of the ones where, I would say just be on the lookout for as you're, switching jobs or as you're getting a little bit older. If you're doing your own contributions versus also a salary deferral, there's kind of a lot of things to coordinate to make sure you don't go over those limits.
I think it's a really good call out, Tim, on the employer contribution going towards that limit. Because to your point, if we think about it through the lens of a employer-sponsored 401k or 403b, it's different, right? And so
Yeah.
if we're applying that same train of thought, that could get us in trouble. Next one is spending on non-qualified expenses. So Tim, I'm thinking of the situation where, hey, maybe I've amassed 10, 15, 20, $30,000 in an HSA, and then there's some large expense that comes up. I don't know, home remodel, paying down some debt that we're just wanting to get rid of, right? Who knows what it could be, a variety of different things. And so there might be this temptation of like, hey, we've got this very real expense in front of us, and we've got these dollars over here that are for a someday expense that comes up, and that could potentially mean those dollars get used and it's a non-qualified expense. So what happens if someone uses their HSA for a non-qualified expense, and why this would potentially be a mistake?
Yeah, so we more often see this, Tim, in like a 401k or an IRA where someone gets desperate and, I would say they misbehave from financially. And I think that's one of the big things that a financial planner really helps is to kind of limit those behavioral mistakes that can have
Mm-hmm.
catastrophic results to the longevity of your financial plan. So, to just kind of take from the 401k, we'll have people that get in trouble with debt or whatever, and they're like, I just want to clear the board and take out my 401k to pay down a credit card debt or pay this bill or whatever. And the haircut that they take on that, 10% penalty plus it triggers tax is astronomical. So when they think they're taking out $10,000, what they actually get might be like 6. So
Mm-hmm.
it's huge. And the HSA cuts even deeper because not only is the penalty double 10% to 20% for an
20,
HSA
yep.
for non-qualified expenses, but you also trigger the tax that you have to pay as well. So we see this less frequently, but it is a thing. But you do not want to use an HSA for non-qualified expenses because of how deep the penalty and the tax, can be.
Mm-hmm.
So that's huge, right? So an HSA, like when you put that money in that account, it better be for qualified expenses, in my opinion, or we just don't touch it.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather, because of how the laws have changed over the years, if it is, medical debt or other types of debt, I would just say carry the debt and figure out a way around that. I would just do whatever you can to avoid using the HSA as a piggy bank for things that aren't qualified under the rules of what, constitutes a qualified expense.
And this is a good segue then into the next one I want to talk about, which is record keeping and not
Yeah.
having, appropriate records. So, I do think as I look at not a commercial for Lively, but we use Lively HSA and there's nice features inside of there where you can easily keep track of receipts and how expenses were. We keep a separate spreadsheet as well, and actually two separate ones. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. So we have receipt record keeping of those that we did use the HSA funds for, and then receipt record keeping of those that we did not use the HSA funds for. So thinking about some of the potential benefit of, hey, healthcare expenses that we could potentially reimburse ourselves back in the future,
Yeah.
but we have good records to prove it. So talk to us about record keeping and why not having record keeping could be a problem, right? You just gave the example of not qualified expenses, but also important otherwise.
Yeah. So like if you're kind of sitting pretty and you're cash flowing things and you're not using your HSA and then something catastrophic happens, you're like, man, these health bills, like we need to use the HSA. Um, you're using the account potentially infrequently, so you're not necessarily, maybe the most keen bookkeeper, record keeper of receipts. But I think you need to be. And the reason for that is that, what the IRS will sometimes look at is, for 5-10 years, everything was pretty much consistent year over year. And then all of a sudden there's a spike and we're taking, we're deducting because of these medical expenses. They might trigger an audit, because anytime they see a difference in stuff, they'll be like, oh, what's going on here? So if that's the case and you don't have those receipts to kind of back up what you are getting reimbursed for, you need the proof. So to me, it's, they're looking for pattern, like breaking the pattern. And if you don't have the receipts to back that up, you could potentially get audited and then, have some of that disallowed. So without receipts, you can't really justify the tax-free result. So people can potentially lose out on thousands of dollars because they didn't keep good records. So to your point, I think keeping good records of what you're using in the HSA and what you're not, potentially, just to have that there, is really, really important. And it's just something that's often forgotten, right? Because you're like, well, it's just, I'm using this for medical expenses. And in my brain, it makes sense. But if you have someone that's looking at your taxes from afar, they're going to want to drill down. And it's something that's, again, out of the ordinary. They're going to want to drill down and try to figure out, okay, is this allowable or not?
Good stuff. Next one is perhaps one that folks might not be thinking about, is thinking about how we look at HSAs for the treatment of death or for beneficiaries. So, similar to our investment accounts, other accounts, we want to have listed beneficiaries. How does that work here, Tim, in terms of HSAs, beneficiaries, and what people should know about naming beneficiaries and how HSAs transfer after death?
Yeah, so if you're married and your spouse isn't listed as a beneficiary, the HSA becomes fully taxable to whoever inherits that. So like all those dreams of triple tax benefit goes out the door for your kind of next in line kin. So naming a spouse keeps the HSA tax benefits intact. So failing to update that beneficiary could cost you dearly from a tax perspective. So, that to me is really important. If you don't have a spouse, it's going to become fully taxable, kind of like an IRA. So it's just important to kind of know, and this goes back to typically, how we round out the financial plan is the estate plan, where we're talking about trusts and wills and power of attorneys, but also a check on beneficiaries from time to time. You hear some horror stories of like, I was married and now I got divorced and now my ex-spouse, potentially gets my, retirement and not necessarily my kids if I were to pass away. So just a check on beneficiaries across the board, but importantly for an HSA, because of the triple tax benefit, it just cuts a little bit deeper if it's not going to the right person. So obviously the spouse is going to be where you direct it. But if not, you still want to make sure, taxes aside, that the dollars that you have are going to go to the right people. So it's really important to make sure that you check those from time to time.
Good reminder, right? Not just for HSAs,
for
you
sure,
highlighted, but with all of our accounts, making sure we're checking beneficiaries once a year, or whatever rhythm we need to have to keep a check on that. Last one I want to talk about is a common mistake of choosing the wrong HSA, right? So just like we talk about with 401ks or IRAs or any investment account, right? Not all accounts are created equal in terms of fees, in terms of investment options. So talk to us about HSA choice in terms of what we can do there and some of the pitfalls that we might want to prevent when choosing an HSA provider.
Yeah, so just like 401ks and 403bs, like not all HSAs, not all 401ks, 403bs are created equal. So there are some that are great, meaning low cost, solid investment choices, and then some that are not. And this is, again, for like all those different types of accounts. The unique thing about the HSA is, compared to like a 401k, is that HSA, you typically have a choice. So if your employer has an HSA that you don't like, you can actually go and be like, I want a different HSA, and set up your own HSA. Now, the problem with that you can run into, and this is some of the things you have to weigh, is it can be a little bit more of a heavier lift for the employer to make sure that your salary deferral is going in the right spot, or if they match, an amount. So you kind of have to, analyze and assess like the risk and reward of like, okay, am I making this too complicated to save a couple dollars in fees and better investment choices versus like the easy button of it just comes right out of my paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those are things to look at. But I would just say, again, as you amass these dollars, it could potentially, we've had 401ks in the past where I'm like, man, like outside of the match, don't fund this because
Yeah, no good.
they're terrible from a choice, from an
Yeah.
expense perspective. Those are coming fewer and far between, but there's still 401ks, HSAs out there that are just not great. So to me, those are the things you have to weigh. Is kind of the ease of use versus, the high fees, the poor investment choices. And sometimes you can, HR, payroll, they don't necessarily like you rocking the boat of maybe doing something that's outside of the HSA, but it is your right to do so. And one of the things that often can happen too is like, I'll talk to a prospective client, and it's not just, 401ks or 403bs that they've amassed over the years. It could be a couple of HSAs that they've amassed over the years from different, employers. They just leave where they're at. And I think that can kind of lead to also like disjointed, strategy in terms of like long-term investment strategy. They're all of these different accounts are kind of doing different things, right? So part of, I think, the process of looking at this is consolidation, right? And just making sure that your philosophy is kind of, being played off the same sheet of music. So yeah, HSAs, there's more choice, but then I think there also can come a little bit more of an administrative burden that, you have to weigh if it makes sense or not.
Tim, as we zoom out for a moment, a question that just came to mind, I'd love to get your perspective. Personally, I'd be curious to know, like, when you look at the HSAs as a part of the broader financial plan, especially if somebody is, let's say, amassing, $100,000+ or on track to do that because they're thinking about it more like a long-term vehicle than a short-term pass-through. When you think of net worth, right, assets minus liabilities, and you're looking at all assets, all liabilities, how do you think about the HSA? Like, does the HSA fit into the asset column, or are you looking at that as sort of like, hey, it's an asset, but because we know we're going to use it for healthcare expenses out of the nine in the future, like, how do you view that, say, in comparison to an IRA, right, or a 401k?
Yeah, it depends. The answer is it depends, Tim. And I think it really depends on, like, I'll give you a for instance, like there are, again, when I talk to prospective clients or clients, a lot of pharmacists that I talk to will have money in a 401k, an IRA, then they have a brokerage account. And I say, one of the questions I ask, let's say they have $40,000 in a brokerage account. I'll ask the question like, hey, what is this money for? And I don't have to ask that for a 401k and or IRA because I know that's for retirement, right? The IRS kind of forces us to make sure that those dollars are used for that purpose, and they allow us for, the tax benefits as such. For something like a brokerage account, like it could be for an investment property, it could be for retirement, it could be for whatever, a vacation. So I put a little bit less weight. If they say it's for retirement, I put a little bit less weight in that unless I understand and I kind of know the client situation a little bit more. So if that client is like, I want to retire at 50, then they better have something in a brokerage account for retirement. So I weight that as a little bit more because there's nothing to say, because you don't have those strings attached to say one day you wake up and it's like, okay, psych, just kidding, it's not for retirement. It's for a vacation property that really caught our eyes when we were at the Outer Banks or something like that. So to answer your question with the HSA, I think it depends on the client, right? So, we have some clients right now that student loans are turning back on and they're kind of scrambling to figure out where those dollars come from, right? Like where, how do I've gone so long without paying student loans. So like, that to me would be a client that I'm weighing that HSA or brokerage account very lightly for the intended use of maybe long-term retirement planning. So what I would say to that is typically it's going to depend on the client and the mentality, because again, you get punched in the face, like the plan goes out the door, right? That's a Mike Tyson quote. So I would say there's a lot more fluidity with those types of accounts than anything else. But that's also not to say that we've seen, clients not necessarily do what's in their best interest, even for retirement accounts. So this money is liquid to you, but the more barriers that you have to step over to use it for an unintended purpose, I think the better in a lot of ways. And again, I don't want anybody to go into credit card debt and things like that, but I just think it depends on the mentality, kind of the breadth of the foundation of their financial plan, kind of are they clued into like their spending more or less year to year? What is their out-term look? How close are they to retirement? You know, how do they view these accounts in their mind? A lot of people, they're like, hey, I'm not touching the 401k until I retire. Some people are like, maybe I could use this for XYZ, right? So it just kind of goes, you know, more into like the behavioral stuff, to be completely honest. And that's a big part of like what we try to make sure is that over decades of a career, we are on our best behavior, because we are inherently wired to not be. We are inherently wired to do things that are against the grain of what we should do in terms of the longevity of our plan. So rant over on that, but I will say my default answer, Tim, would be it depends.
Yeah, and just to add on to that point, if you're listening and saying, you know what, like, I'm not my worst enemy, that's not me, go check out episode 124, way back from the archives. I interviewed Dr. Daniel Crosby, who wrote The Laws of Wealth, the behavioral investor, behavioral psychologist, essentially, that studies, you know, human behavior around money. And I think that might help. I know it humbled me a little bit in that process as well. But I was really curious. I didn't have a formed opinion on that. Just speaking about what Jess and I do, like we track it as we're looking at overall net worth with everything else, more than anything, to have eyes on it. You know, it's not something I look at and say, hey, this is going to be a large percentage of our nest egg by any means, but it just helps us keep an eye on just the overall account, forces us to kind of look back periodically and say, okay, how much do we want to be liquid? What expenses do we have coming up? We got 3 embraces right now. How much are we going to cash flow? How much are we going to pay out of the HSA? What's coming out of other, you know, savings accounts, et cetera. So I like tracking it and thinking about it in the context of net worth, just to have eyes on it as the overall puzzle, right? This, of course, being one piece.
I personally do too. Like, I look at that as an asset, kind of similar to I look at like an IRA, me personally.
Yeah.
Because I know that there are going to be many, many other levers that I would pull to pay for today medical expenses before I would use the HSA. So obviously, you know, things like an emergency fund, things like that I would dip into, probably even a line of credit, I would do before I would pull money from the HSA. But that also assumes that you have like a good foundation, right? And
reserves,
that's just my own. But again, not everyone is on that same page. So, you know, it will depend. But I kind of look at it more as like a cherry on top. It's not the driving force of what will be a major component of my retirement paycheck, but it'll be a nice tertiary bucket to draw from for whatever reason.
Great stuff, Tim. And if we keep the puzzle analogy going for just one more minute, like the visual that was coming to mind for me is we're talking about, let's say we're putting together a 100-piece puzzle, right? We're talking about one piece of the 100-piece puzzle, right? And if we zoom out, you know, eventually we got to put the borders together, and then eventually we're going to start to fill in the puzzle. And so if you're listening to this thinking, hey, I could use some help, not only with my HSA, right? That's one piece of the puzzle, but also the broader financial plan. We talked about the estate plan. We talked about how this might touch Social Security. We talked about how it might touch retirement planning and building a retirement paycheck, right? So if you're hearing that and saying, hey, I could use help with the broader, the more comprehensive financial plan, we would love to connect further to hear more about what's going on in your financial situation, to share more about our fee-only comprehensive financial planning services and how our team of CFPs may be able to help. So if that piques some interest, head on over to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You'll see a link at the top of the homepage where you can book a discovery call. It'll take you through a brief questionnaire, and then you'll have about a 45 to 60-minute discovery call with Tim Baker. So again, main page, yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and then you'll see an option there to book a discovery call.